This is our suicide and self-harm prevention webinar, and the recording will be shared in Team Talk on Monday. If you have missed any of our webinars so far, the links are available on the People portal, so please take a look at the additions if you're interested in our previous sessions. So for today, we have some questions submitted before the session. Some of these will be answered during the course of the presentation, and we'll cover the others after the presentation. Please feel free to raise any questions in the chat too, and we'll do our best to get through some of these at the end. I'll make a note of any of the questions asked during the chat. However, once the Q&A is started, we will not be able to take any more questions. I'd now like to introduce Katie Connolly from Health Partners, who will be leading this session on suicide and self-harm prevention. Over to you, Katie.
Thank you, Katie, for the introduction. Just making sure that you can see that, Katie, the first slide there.
I can, yes.
Okay, great. So first of all, thank you for having me today. My name is Katie Connolly and I'm a cognitive behavioural therapist, currently working with Psych Health. I have experience of working on the NHS over in England and also in private practice. So you're all very welcome to the workshop today. It's also important to make you all aware that these topics can be difficult to talk about. And because of that, there will be further resources and information on what support is available at the end of the presentation. So let's get started. So first of all, the workshop content. So let's have a look at what we'll be covering. So there'll be a general introduction. We'll be looking at why talking matters. We'll be looking at who is at risk and what the warning signs of suicide and self-harm are. We'll be looking in more detail at suicide and self-harm. We'll be looking at what you could say and do if you find yourself in a situation of crisis, or maybe you know someone who you think might be feeling suicidal or self-harming. We'll also be looking at general support and well-being and what you can do to support yourself and other people as well. As I said, there'll be some further resources and also some time for some questions and answers. So next slide then. So the learning outcomes. So what do we want you to take from this workshop? So we want to increase your understanding of suicide and self-harm. We want you to be better equipped at recognising the warning signs in the people you encounter. We want you to feel more confident in raising the issue of suicide and self-harm with those you feel concerned about. People naturally would sometimes shy away from vocalising these words, so we're going to be talking a wee bit more about how just raising the issue with someone can be a really big step and can help so much. We're going to hopefully give you a better understanding in how to promote positive mental health and resilience. And hopefully by the end of the workshop, you'll be feeling more confident about how to support someone in crisis. So let's start by looking at some statistics. Suicide is more common than we think. So this particular slide looks at suicides in England. So you can see there that in the figures, in purple writing are considerably higher for males than for females. And on the right hand side there, you can see that particular age groups with the highest suicide rates per 100,000 people. So for males, we've got between there 50 and 54, and females 45 and 49. And we'll be looking at that in some more detail later on. So suicide affects predominantly more men than women, which I'm sure some of you will have heard before. Some reasons for this include that females are generally more likely to talk about their difficulties and get help. Females are more likely to communicate and open up, talk with colleagues, friends, maybe even managers or people in the workplace about their current difficulties. So why does this happen? From the moment we are born, from the moment we come into this earth, we start to think and behave based on the messages we are given from other people, from our family, from society itself. And we know that males are told, from young ages, oh, big boys don't cry, or man up. we have to think about what kind of messages that starts to send to males, even though the male brain is in no way biologically different in terms of emotion to the female brain. Society would make us think otherwise. What is good is that this conversation, talking about mental health, talking about suicide, self-harm, having those conversations are starting to change that view very slowly, but it is starting to make some changes. So let's look then at the next slide, which looks at suicide stigma, and also myth busting. So to increase understanding about suicide and better support those people who are affected by suicide, we need to challenge these commonly held myths and misconceptions. So we're going to look here on this side at some of those stigmas or myths that you might have come across before. So the first one there, all people who are at risk of suicide have depression or another mental illness. This is a common myth that I've come across myself very often. So having suicidal thoughts can happen to anyone, regardless of whether or not they have a mental illness. While people living with a mental illness are at increased risk, the relationship is more complex than that. And people who have never experienced a diagnosable mental health difficulty can experience suicidal thoughts. Next of all, we've got people who think about suicide are selfish or weak, another really commonly held myth and misconception. So any talk about suicide must be taken extremely seriously. People who talk about wanting to end their lives or suicide itself can often think about suicide. You might not believe that the reason they are thinking about ending their life or the reason they're having these kinds of thoughts may warrant. What was that? Sorry, I think someone maybe has their microphone off mute. Just to remind you all to please keep your microphones on mute, and if you've got any questions, use the chat box and we can discuss those at the end. So just going back to that, people who think about suicide are selfish or weak. Yes, so you might not believe the reason that they're thinking this. Thinking about any of their life warrants, or the things they're going through warrants these thoughts. But remember that their experiences might be very different to yours, and most likely are. All of our experiences are very different. So just talking about it might be a way of them communicating that they need some support. So let's look at the next one then. There's little warning if a person intends to take their own life. So most people who are suicidal do express some signs of intent. But these are often not easy to recognize or understand. People may indicate their intent directly, like for example, talking about it, talking about wanting to die, or indirectly, which would be like speaking abstractly about death, referencing suicide in things like poetry or art. If you have any concerns, you should discuss these with someone you trust, with the person themselves, or with a health professional. Okay, so the next one, asking someone about suicide or self-harm plants the idea in their head. So if you're having this kind of if you believe this myth, or you have, this is a belief of yours, understandably you want to avoid talking about suicide or self-harm with someone. Suicide prevention experts generally agree that asking someone whether they're thinking about suicide will not increase their risk. And one of the only ways to know if a person is contemplating suicide is to ask them. Asking someone and having this conversation is difficult, but it shows that you care. Despite it being a difficult conversation, just asking them can be the first step for them to get the help and support that they need. So the next one then, it is impossible to stop it is possible to stop someone's intent on suicide. So suicide is not inevitable and may be prevented. Immediate practical help can deflect a person's suicidal intentions in the short term. Stay with the person and encourage them to talk about how they feel, what's got them to the place that they're in, and help them to plan for the future. Seek professional and social support to help them in the long term. Finally, we've got, once someone has attempted suicide and survived, it means that they'll never try again. So having a suicidal attempt in your history is actually considered a risk factor, and it stays with you throughout your life. It's likely the level of danger will increase with each subsequent attempt, and the risk is high for the first 3 months to a year after an attempt. It declines after that, but as I say, it's something that would certainly be considered going forward. Okay, so let's look next at the impact of suicide on other people. So suicide can have a bit of a ripple effect, and in fact, 1 in 10 people who attempt suicide have themselves been bereaved through suicide. The death of a co-worker, a friend, a family member, or a loved one can have a devastating effect on those left behind and result in feelings of guilt, increasing their risk themselves. So, for example, the impact can involve extreme guilt for not preventing the suicide, feelings of failure because a person that they loved felt unloved and completed suicide, anger or resentment at the person who chose to take his or her own life, feelings of confusion, distress over possibly unresolved issues, and higher rates of mental health difficulties, for example, depression or PTSD. So this is the interpersonal theory of suicide. So this is a model that has been created to help us understand why people choose to end their life. So in the first circle there on the top left-hand side, which is labeled feelings of isolation, we have the thought in quotation marks, I am alone. Beside that, we have the circle which is labeled feelings of burdensomeness and the thought, I am a burden. So these two feelings and thoughts combined can result in a desire for suicide. You'll see the circle below, which is purple, labeled capability for suicide. I'm not afraid to die. So this thought and this feeling that you're not afraid to die increases your risk. And that's because fear of death, including by suicide, is a natural and extremely powerful human instinct. The theory that paired with the two circles at the top and the purple circle increases your risk proposes that repeated exposure to traumatic events, engaging in self-harm behavior and suicidal ideation might desensitize you to suicide, and you might become habituated to death itself, which can increase the capability for suicidal behaviors. So this might be why a history of attempted suicide is a #1 predictor of future attempts. As well as that, certain professions, as you can imagine, being a police, first responder, being in the military, being a surgeon, when you're constantly exposed to things like death, might put you at higher risk of suicide. So let's look then at the difference between suicide and self-harm and looking into those a wee bit more. So we have here the commonly known, what self-harm can also be commonly known as. So you might have heard self-harm be described as self-injurious behavior, self-mutilation, non-suicidal self-injury, parasuicide, deliberate self-harm, self-abuse, and self-inflicted violence. The majority of people who do self-injure do not have suicidal thoughts when self-injuring, and that was a 2014 study that found that. Although self-harm is not the same as suicide, it can escalate into suicidal behaviors, and the intent to die can change over time. And another study by the same researcher found that almost half of people who self-harmed reported at least having one suicide attempt in their lives. So let's look some more then at what self-harm and suicide actually looks like. So in terms of frequency, self-harm incidents will be more frequent than suicide, which would happen less frequently. Methods would include for self-harm things like cutting, burning, self-hitting. For suicide, that might mean things like self-poisoning. In terms of severity, self-harm can be less severe, whereas suicide is more severe and sometimes lethal. Now, the purpose of self-harm, for example, one reason can be to avoid suicidal impulses, whereas the purpose of suicide can be done with the actual intent to die. So a lot of you might be asking, well, why do people self-harm? You know, if you're already experiencing significant and severe emotional distress and psychological distress, why would you want to make yourself feel worse? So it might seem a bit odd or strange, but there's a couple of different reasons why people do this. So the first reason can be to feel better. Self-harm can release feelings that have been pent up, such as anger or anxiety, as well as that often people who self-harm report feeling numb, and self-harming can actually help them to feel something. Even though it's painful, it's helping them to feel something. It might be to communicate their emotional pain. So for example, someone might find it difficult to vocalize that they have really been struggling, that they have been feeling suicidal, that they have been self-harming themselves. And so that they don't have to say that, they might communicate that indirectly by, putting their wounds, exposing their wounds to show other people, or, making it obvious that they are injured in some way. Also, another reason that people self-harm can be to feel a sense of control. So people who self-harm might feel powerless and lack self-esteem, and it can be used as a way to regain control. It's particularly common for people who have suffered abuse, and there's often a pronounced feeling of powerlessness or self-loathing, and that absence of self-esteem. People can also self-harm to punish themselves. So because they lack self-esteem and they do not think highly of themselves, their opinion of themselves will be very low. They feel at fault for this, and this can be a way of punishing themselves. So how can we tell if someone is self-harming? How can you become more aware of that? So here are some behaviours, some signs to look out for that might suggest someone is injuring themselves. The person might appear more quiet or reserved than they usually are. You might notice them change in personality. They might stop participating in regular activities, things they would generally do in their day-to-day lives. They might have some rapid mood changes, and that can be increase in mood or significant decrease in mood. They might get angry or upset easily. You might notice smaller things upset them easier than they normally would. These people might suffer poor academic or social performance when usually they would manage these things quite well. And they might exhibit unexplained cuts or scratches. They might wear clothes that are inappropriate for the weather, wearing a big coat in the summertime or long sleeves when it's hot outside. They might have had a significant event in their lives, such as a breakup, a bereavement, a job loss, or maybe hearing that they are clinically experiencing illness, or they've been diagnosed with a terminal illness. So what about suicide then? How might the warning signs for suicide differ to self-harm, and what are those warning signs? So warning signs for suicide include talking about or wanting to die or killing oneself. It might be more common in their narrative or in their conversations with other people. They might be looking for a way to end their lives, for example, buying a gun, or looking into how they might end their lives through maybe self-poisoning. They might be talking about feeling hopeless or having no reason to live. They might be talking about feeling trapped or in unbearable pain. They might see no way out of their situation. They might think suicide is the only way out of their situation. They might be talking about being a burden to other people. You might notice an increase in alcohol or drug use. This person might be withdrawing. You might hear them talk about feeling isolated. As mentioned earlier, they might display extreme mood swings. These next two are also important to be aware of. Often what can happen is people have been enduring so much distress and they decide that, okay, I've decided to end my life. I'm gonna end my life. And because they've made that decision, that can be a massive relief, and they might feel really good that their suffering and their pain is gonna come to an end. And as a result of this, they might start to give away their belongings. They might start to have conversations with you that might seem strange, in the sense that they are saying goodbye, or you sense that the conversation isn't the kind of conversation they would usually have. And they might also give away, the things that mean a lot to them, or talk about death in a positive light. So those are also things to be aware of that you might not normally associate with suicide. So what about men specifically? So many of the symptoms are universal, but some signs are more common in men than in women. Things to look out for in men would be increased substance abuse, increased anger and irritability, change in working patterns. So for example, working obsessively. They might describe sleep difficulties, or you might notice reckless behavior. For example, reckless driving or driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs. So why men specifically? So this will expand some more on those earlier statistics that we were talking about. So there's a couple of different factors that put men more at risk of suicide than women. Men currently make up 75% of all suicides in England and Wales, and that's considerably higher than in women. Men aged 45 to 59 have the highest suicide rate in the UK. Men report lower levels of life satisfaction than women, so that might be one of the reasons that they are more at risk of ending their lives. Men are less likely to access psychological therapies than women, and going back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of men are less likely to open up, reach out, seek help due to that stigma that society has put on talking about mental health difficulties, specifically for men, making them less likely to look for treatment. 90% of homeless people in London itself are men, and we know that things like homelessness can increase your risk of suicide. 5% of men compared to 7% of women have reported being a victim of domestic violence. Men, we know, would underreport things like domestic violence, and things like situations like domestic violence can put you at risk of suicide, because that's extremely traumatic and difficult experience to go through. Men make up the vast majority of the prison population, and we know that in prisons suicides are high. Men experience more substance abuse and dependence, again putting them at risk. Men account for 79% of drug-related deaths. And the outward expression of male distress causes significant problems for other men, women, and children. Men are conditioned from an early age not to show emotion, and if they are going to show emotion, they show it in anger, and that can cause problems for themselves, other men, women, and children. Okay, so let's look at suicide and self-harm risk factors. So what other things can put you at risk of wanting to end your life or self-harming? Things like mental health difficulties, mental illness, alcohol or drug misuse, being socially isolated, living on your own, not having a lot of social support, things like debilitating illness, past abuse experiences, ACEs, or also known as adverse childhood experiences, so experiences through childhood that have been really difficult to go through and had an impact on your personality, and also a family history of suicide. So what about the stigma of discussing mental health? So we often hear that talking about mental health difficulties carries a stigma, and this stigma plays a big part in the prevalence of mental health difficulties in society because it stops people from opening up, talking about what they're going through and seeking support. So what exactly is a stigma? It can be defined as a quality that is considered to be shameful in a certain individual. A social stigma, prejudicial attitudes and discriminating behaviour directed towards individuals by the wider society. And a perceived stigma or self-stigma, internalising the societal perceptions of discrimination. So similarly, the 2021 census, in the 2021 census, nearly 15% of the population had been prescribed antidepressants. Often people are reluctant to take antidepressants or approach their doctor to talk about antidepressants. They might, because of the stigma, they think that, well, that might affect things like my employment opportunities in future. Well, if this was true, the unemployment rate would be much higher than the 2021 statistics suggest, which is 4.2%. So that societal view, some view that people have on taking, for example, medication to help your mental health can stop people from seeking the support that they need. So what we're going to be doing now is looking at what you can do, what we can do as a society to start to change this stigma. So how can we start to turn mental health awareness into mental health action? I'm sure most of you will have noticed in more recent years that mental health is actually being started to being talked about more. It's becoming more frequent in our conversations. We're noticing it a lot more. It's being talked about a lot more in the media, and that is really good because it shows a societal shift. Society is starting to change how it views mental health difficulties, and that is really good, and that's progress. But what we've got to start doing here is looking at, okay, how we're all becoming more aware of mental health difficulties. How can we start to change the stigma, and how can we change that into action? So Gandhi famously said, "Be the change you wish to see in the world." If we are silent, the stigma continues to exist. So let's look at what you can do to start to remove that stigma and therefore make people more comfortable and encourage people more to seek the support that they need. That means people are going to be seeking more support, getting the services they need, and that benefits society themselves as a whole. And that then is passed on through generations, which over time will improve our mental health as a society. So reframe, rather than ask why the suicide or self-harm, we need to ask why the pain. I did some volunteering with a charity here in Northern Ireland called PIPS, which is the Public Intervention for Prevention of Suicide. And they have a really good slogan, which is look beyond the behaviour and see the person who's hurting. Instead of just seeing at surface level what they're doing, we've got to look at, well, why are they doing this? And reframing means the ability to see the same set of facts in an entirely new way. When we come to mental health, that is what we need to do, move towards a societal and personal reframe. And as a society, we need to reframe how we view mental health difficulties, how we view suicide, how we view self-harm. This will help to make care, treatment, help and support more accessible, diminishing the cost and impact on our families and on society itself. And that reframe starts with us. So number one, so these are the three things that you can start to do to put that shift into practice and get the ball rolling on that shift. Number one is to change your language. A lot of the stigmas we have show up in the language that we use, using language like he's a psycho, she's crazy, he's lost his marbles, she's away with the fairies. All these phrases just show that the social stigma is pervasive and show our judgment in basically the language that we use. A change in language to be less judgmental and more understanding is going to help to remove this stigma. So if you just have a think about that, about the last time you described something as being crazy or as being mental, those are things that don't help shift the societal shift that needs to happen to help us be more open and accepting and non-judgmental about mental health difficulties. So number two, educate yourself. So we know that it is not one thing that causes mental health difficulties. There is no one reason. It's become clear through research that it is a combination of biological, psychological, social, and environmental factors that can lead to mental health difficulties. None of us asked to be born. We all just find ourselves in this world, and therefore we cannot be to blame for our difficulties. What we can be, though, is accountable for how we act, and that means educating yourself on mental health itself, what causes mental health difficulties, and that will help to remove this stigma and move us in the right direction. Mental illness is not a flaw in character, and if we can get our facts straight, that can move us in the right direction. Then number three, let's talk about it. The elephant in the room is a metaphor for an obvious truth that is being ignored or not spoken about. The best thing to deal with an elephant is to name it, to get it out in the open. Let's talk openly about mental health itself, how suicide, mental health, self-harm really affects us all. Either directly, we might know someone who's self-harming, or indirectly, we've heard of someone who has ended their life. Talking about mental health will help us all to see that having highs and having lows are just part of a normal human experience, and they're all as part of a universal human experience. We all experience down days, and we all have times that we're not feeling ourselves and we're not feeling good. Talking about that and opening up with friends and colleagues helps to remove that stigma and moves us again in the right direction. So how do you support someone in crisis? So suicide prevention starts with recognizing the warning signs and taking them seriously. If you think a family friend, a friend or a family member is suicidal, there's plenty that you can do to help save a life. So here are 5 action steps that you can take to support someone in crisis. Watch out for warning signs, changes in stress and behavior. Speak up and ask, vocalize the words suicide, self-harm. Are you thinking of ending your life? Are you thinking of suicide? Are you thinking about hurting yourself? Be supportive, take the person seriously, listen to them carefully and without judgment. Get professional help. Try to encourage the person to get the help that they need, and stay connected. Keeping in touch after a crisis can make a significant difference, and it really shows that you care. And that is what someone who's feeling that way needs at that moment, knowing that people are there for them and people care about them. So how do you support someone who is, sorry, just going back to the previous slide. So if you suspect that a friend or a colleague is self-harming, even if they're struggling, offer a listening ear, encourage them to talk and let them know that help is available and they're not on their own. Starting a conversation with someone about their mental health can be really helpful. It may be the first time somebody has actually asked them, and it may offer a huge sense of relief to acknowledge that this is how they're feeling, and starting a conversation about mental health, as I said earlier, shows that you care. Up until this point, this person might just have been thinking about suicide or thinking about self-harming. when we actually say these words, it normalizes them, that, this is something that it's possible to go through, and addressing that will help alleviate some of that person's distress and help them to get the support that they need. It might not even alleviate distress, or not that it wouldn't alleviate distress, but just talking about it might not solve anything, but talking about it itself can alleviate some distress. So if you feel an individual is in immediate danger and there is an emergency, for example, if they tell you they have a plan of action to end their life or intend to act on thoughts of suicide, do not leave them on their own. Try to remove the means of harm or suicide from the immediate environment and seek further support. Perhaps contact their GP on their behalf, call 999 if there is urgent concern, or if needs be, accompany them to A&E and stay with them until they are seen. Hearing that a friend, family member or colleague is suicidal can be really difficult for yourself, so make sure that if you need to, seek the necessary support that you need to if you find yourself in that kind of situation by talking to someone you trust. So let's look at how to support someone who is self-harming, the do's and the don'ts. Things you can do or things that are good to do. Relate to them as a whole person and not just someone who self-harms. Ask about how they're feeling, validate their pain. Let them be in control of the decisions that they make. Don't tell them they need to do something. Talk to them about why you think this might be helpful and what they think about that. Let the person know you're there for them. Encourage them to seek professional help or offer help to help them find it. Do some research on their behalf, for example. Things that you shouldn't do. Don't focus on the behavior itself. Don't try to force change or tell them they need to do something. Act or communicate in a way that threatens to take control away from the person. Don't ignore their injuries, brush them under the carpet. As the same as that, don't overly focus on them or stare at them. Don't label self-harm as attention seeking or acting out. That might be an indirect way of them saying, as discussed earlier, that they need help. Don't avoid the subject, and don't try not to panic or overreact in that situation. So this next slide, introducing the acronym ALAN. ALAN is a really helpful way of reminding ourselves how to support someone who is struggling. So if you remember ALAN, the A, ask open questions. How are you feeling? How is your mood? Instead of the general day-to-day, how are you? Asking someone how their mood is today, or how they're feeling, is a more open-ended question and helps to start that conversation. Show concern, but don't judge. Listen, let them speak. You don't need to solve any problems. As I said, just a conversation can help alleviate the stress. You might not solve anything through that, but that's okay. They might just need to get stuff off their chest, and we know that just talking about something can help. ALA, A for action. Help them to make a plan of action and let them know what help is out there. Arrange the next time you two would meet up. And finally, the N stands for network. Build a network of support together with other friends and family, and maybe professionals, mental health professionals. Okay, so this next slide, Talk Club, there's a video here. So Talk Club is a club that has been put together and created by a man called Ben Ackers. He lost his friend Steve, his best friend Steve, to suicide. And he set up this club to help men, it's exclusive for men, help encourage men to meet up and talk. So if you can imagine, if we want to get fit, we decide, okay, we're going to start going to the gym. It's the same with talking. If we want to get mentally fit, going somewhere, talking about it can help us to feel better. Okay, so I'm just going to make sure that the sound is on for this.
What is Talk Club? Talk Club is a talking and listening community for men, a mental fitness movement. Like going to the gym, but for your mind. It helps you check in with how you feel and own it. It's all based around how are you out of 10 and explaining why. So how does it work? It begins online. Go to wetalkclub.com, join the main group, and then a talking club near you. Find the meeting, come along. Groups are held in private areas of public spaces where men feel comfortable, like above pubs or gyms. There are normally 8 to 10 men to a talk. The captain leads the group and reminds everyone to switch off their phones, to respect each other, and to give no advice. Everything stays confidential between the group. There's a talking board, so everyone can take their turn to talk, and most importantly, not talk over each other. Each man talks while everyone else listens, and then passes the ball on to the next. The captain begins with how are you out of 10, 1 being the lowest, 10 being the highest. Then try and explain why. After everyone has talked, we then move on to the second round. What are you happy about? What are you really grateful for? Family, job, hobby. Then it's what are your plans for mental fitness this week? Exercise, learning, mindfulness. And before we finish, check out numbers. What are you now? This helps us to see that by sharing we can feel lighter than when we came in. That's it. 4 simple questions, 2 simple numbers, a little bit of talking and a lot of listening. And somehow that lasts 2 hours. Talk, listen, together. wetalkclub.com.
So Talk Club itself started with, I think, 8 people, and there are now over 1,000 men throughout England meeting up and attending Talk Club. So let's move to the next slide then.
What is talk?
Okay, so prevention is better than cure, and taking care of yourself is a really good way of protecting yourself from stress, and managing stress helps you to manage stress, and protecting yourself from mental health difficulties are helping you to manage those a bit better. So taking care of yourself can be defined as the practice of taking action to preserve one's own physical and mental health. And if you think that you have heard a lot more about things like self-care recently, you wouldn't be far wrong, because we know that Google Trends have told us that self-care searches in the Google engine have more than doubled since 2015, which is really good because we are now all becoming more aware and prioritizing our mental health and mental well-being by looking for things we can do to look after ourselves. So looking after yourself, or self-care, is making time for things that are good for you and will benefit you, things that you know will do you good. And as I said, maintains resilience and improves ability to handle everyday stress. I actually recently heard an advert for something on TV. I'm not exactly sure what it was for, but in the advert, the guy was giving his friend some advice. I think he said something along the lines of, you should try looking after yourself as though you look after your cat. He said, you feed it regularly, you let it outside once in a while, and you give it love and affection. And I thought that was a really good way of demonstrating how we're really good at looking after other people, or better at looking after other people than we are at looking after ourselves sometimes. So the things you can do to look after yourself are those things that you've heard time and time and time again: exercise, eating healthily, getting out in nature, meeting up with friends and family, learning a new skill. Those things that we always hear about. And we always hear about them because we know they are good and they help us. So self-care or looking after yourself can be divided into 5 areas: mental self-care, physical self-care, emotional self-care, spiritual self-care, and social self-care. So these are some examples of what looking after yourself might look like for you. Mental self-care might be reading a book, learning a new skill. You might exercise, look after yourself physically. Emotional self-care might be attending a therapy session or meeting up with people to talk about something that's been difficult for you. Spiritually, you might be religious, you might not. Things like meditation can help you connect with your spiritual self if you're not religious, and if you do have a faith, attending things like church can help with that. And then social self-care, so phoning in people in your close circle to catch up, or maybe talk about things that have been bothering you, or just to talk about how their day's gone. So finally here we've got a slide with some resources and support services that you can avail of after today's session. So we've got there the mental wellbeing journey within Jaguar Land Rover, the Samaritan's number, which you can call 24/7, the employee assistance program, BEN, which is the automotive industry charity exclusive to people who have worked or are working in the industry, and then Harmless, which is a user-led organisation with some further information on self-harm. So next of all then, the final slide, which is just to cover some questions. So Katie kindly emailed me some questions before the presentation. Most of those have been covered in the presentation. However, there were 1 or 2 which I thought would be good to cover. So someone had asked about are the signs different in children? Which is a great question. So the signs do overlap significantly. So with change in behaviour, change in sleeping patterns for children, change in eating patterns, you might notice that they become more withdrawn and significant changes in mood. They might talk about psychosomatic symptoms such as headaches or a sore tummy. Also consider how their behaviour might have changed in school. So their academic performance might have dropped. You might notice they're not as willing to participate in after school clubs or sports. And you might notice a change in their language. So talking about death, talking about other people missing them when they die, maybe similarly with adults giving away the things that they, things that they really love, their most loved possessions. So those are things to be looking out for in children. Another question, which was a good question, was what happens after 50? Someone asked about, why is 50 always mentioned? What happens after 50 that makes me more at risk of suicide or makes us more at risk? Nothing happens to your brain after the age of 50. After you turn 50, there's no immediate change or anything like that. But we do know that the combination of factors at that age, like for example, the men's role in society, people retire around the age of 50, 60, 70, which can lead to a loss of feeling of purpose, which can put you at risk of things like suicide. Also, around that age, your health can start to deteriorate, and things like terminal illness, so lack of dignity in terms of personal care, can lead people, and men specifically, to think want to end their lives. Whereas women, we know, would use the support available to them, or more likely to use the support available to them. So those are the 2 questions that I felt weren't answered as well, and that I wanted to make sure those were covered at the end of the presentation. So Katie, I'll hand over to you in terms of the other questions that might be asked in the chat.
Yeah, so just linking back to the children question, we had one question that said, what can you do if your child does not want to go to therapy?
Okay, so what can you do if your child does not want to go to therapy? So it would be about having that conversation with your GP having the conversation with your child about, you know, what it is that's getting in the way of going to therapy for them, you know, what their worries, what their concerns are. It might be also useful to talk to them about what therapy might be, what therapy might look like, and also reach out to your local NHS service, because they will have come across that difficulty many times when children are reluctant to attend things like therapy, and they will have some resources available to you, and there will be practitioners there that may be able to speak with you about how you can talk to your child about therapy and about how therapy might be helpful for them. So certainly reach out to your local trust and seek resources there, and also just having that conversation with what your child's thoughts or worries are about therapy, and what might be getting in the way of that for them.
Okay. If somebody attempts suicide or self-harm, are they more likely to attempt it again?
So yes, that was discussed earlier in the presentation, but just to recap that, having a suicide attempt in your past does put you at risk of a further suicide attempt. It's something we always consider in things like therapy. It's something I would be sure to talk about in my first assessments with people. The risk does decrease after the first year, but having one suicide attempt, yes, does put you at risk of another suicide attempt. But it's important to be aware of how this is all situational. It depends on the person's situation at that time in their environment. They might have tried to take their own life and things might have significantly improved since then, which is really good. That always will stay there and that does increase their risk, but things might be a lot better for them and they might be managing things a lot better. Additionally, things might have got worse and that is therefore going to put them more at risk of a suicide attempt. So it's good to be aware of. Any other questions?
Yeah, so one says, I'm aware that statistics often record that women admit to attempting more often than men. Do you think it's possible, based on the suicide death rate in men, that men actually do attempt more but don't want to report it, based on the societal view of man up, etc.?
So just to clarify, you're asking that, or you're saying the question asks, is it that men are less likely to report that they have tried to take their own
Yes.
lives? Yes, absolutely. So if we go back to those societal pressures and the messages that we are given based on our gender from the moment we're born, from the moment we come into this earth, men are told to push their feelings away, not to appear tearful, not to appear emotional, not to talk about their feelings. On that phrase, or that phrase we often hear, man up. So therefore, that would suggest that based on society, men are less likely to talk about or tell people about the amount of times or whether they have tried to take their own lives or not, based on things like shame, the shame of that, or how other people might perceive that.
Okay. And do you have any resources that could be suggested for supporting non-verbal autistic children who have PTSD and ADHD, but have also attempted suicide in the past?
Absolutely. So that is quite a niche area in terms of how we talk to people, especially children who have an autism diagnosis or an ADHD diagnosis. It might mean that we need to use the language we need to use might be a bit different, or we need to consider their diagnosis when talking about things like suicide and self-harm. So yes, what I can do is I can forward some resources on to Katie, and then the person that has asked that question, Katie, maybe you could take their details and email that on to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Katie, it would also be really helpful for me if you could just make a note of that question, maybe just copy and paste it, and then I'll be able to get the correct and the best resources to answer that question for that person.
Yes, no problem at all. And probably got time for one more question.
No problem.
What about a person that's been given warning signs for suicide for a number of years, to the point that it's a common topic, but without ever taking any suicidal or self-harming action?
So could you repeat that question, please? I just didn't hear the beginning.
So what would you do in the situation where a person has been given warning signs for suicide, to the point it's a common topic, but without ever taking any suicidal or self-harming actions?
Okay, so as discussed earlier in the presentation, suicide it's important we take any talk of suicide or self-harm extremely seriously. So just because the person has talked about it several times, but hasn't acted on it, doesn't mean that they won't. So it's really important to make sure that person is in touch with their GP. The GP is aware of these conversations that they're having, and also that that person is supported in terms of socially. So making sure that they're aware that they have social support, people to talk to if they're feeling suicidal or self-harming. So despite the fact they've talked about it several times and not acted on thoughts of suicide, or not tried to take their own life, or maybe they haven't self-harmed, it's still a serious conversation to have, and something not to be brushed under the carpet, or being not to take it in any other way other than seriously. So making sure that person has the resources available to them in terms of social support, and that their GP is aware. If you are worried about someone at that risk, have that conversation with them, and make sure that they are aware that you are there and you care, and you can even look into other research opportunity or research resources for them in terms of helping them get the support that they need.
Okay, lovely. I think we are out of time now, so thank you everyone for attending. Apologies if we haven't got round to your question. A copy of the recording will be available later in the week, and I have shared a feedback form on the chat. If we'd be grateful for any feedback that you'd be able to provide.
Thank you very much,
for your time, Katie.
Thank you, and thank you all for having me today.
Thank you very much. Take care, everybody.
All the best. Bye. Thank you.